Well, thank you so much, Heike. It's really nice to be, well, virtually back at DAL at least. And I think the way that I balanced sailing and diving is that I always went sailing when the wind was the highest, and I always went diving when there was no wind. So it worked out really well for the first couple of years. And then I fell in love with science and went all in on science. And now I just sail for fun. So, but yeah, I'm really happy to be here today. And I'm going to get a little bit to talk about kelp forests and blue carbon. But I figured that I would be remiss if I didn't begin by sort of reflecting on the last time I really was at Dalhousie. So I did my PhD with Bob Scheibling as part of the Scheibling Lab Fund Seekers. So the last sort of time, right after my thesis defense, we had the classic thesis party that involved a pink wig, which was passed down to every student of Bob's that you got to wear. And the keen ecologist will, of course, recognize that this cake is indeed a ball and cup diagram describing a regime shift. And this night ended with me giving an interpretive dance, which was also mandatory, of every chapter of my PhD thesis. So I can definitely promise that this won't be quite as entertaining as that, but hopefully still a little bit memorable. So the title of this talk is Kelp and Blue Carbon. It's a little bit of a hot topic nowadays. And this is because one of the main actions that we have actually to combat climate change, especially as ecologists, is to better understand the carbon cycling of natural ecosystems, and also to act to increase our carbon stores and sinks. And to date, most of our actions to do this have actually been focused on terrestrial forests on land. And if you just tuned in at all to the most recent COP in Glasgow, you could see all of the really exciting international initiatives to restore our forests on land and to regrow and protect these forests for their carbon benefits and other benefits. So sort of at the same time, there's been a much lesser, but also a growing appreciation about the role of forests in the ocean. Sometimes these are called blue forests or blue carbon ecosystems. And they typically range from mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes, and also more recently, some people are including kelp and other large seaweed forests in this. And there's a lot of evidence showing that these coastal vegetated marine ecosystems are sites of intense cycling and storage of carbon. And also more broadly, that the carbon cycling in the coastal zone is really a critical and a mostly unresolved component of the carbon cycle. And so I mentioned that kelp forests aren't typically included in blue carbon assessments. But if you look at, this is a map of Australia, and this shows the distribution of the different types of blue forests. So here, kelp forests are in the southern coast, which is the cooler coast in Australia. And they're sort of bordering along what we call the Great Southern Reef. So if you excluded kelp forests from a blue forest assessment, you would almost miss half of the coastal zone of the whole continent. And if you look at the total above ground carbon stock and the estimated sequestration rates of these habitats, kelp forests are contributing quite substantially to the overall blue carbon, about 20 to 30%, depending on sort of the range of margin you're using in the various calculations. So in order to fully capture carbon storage potential in the coastal zone, we should probably also look at our seaweed forests. So if we zoom out, this is the global distribution of the world's kelp forest. They cover just over 25% of the coastlines in the world. And the best estimates to date are that they total 1.5 to 2 million square kilometers in area. This is about the size of the Amazon rainforest. And they come in a number of shapes and sizes. I've just colored different dominant genera to give an example of the diversity across their range. And one thing that kelps are really known for is their large productivity. So this is work done by a PhD student that I supervise, Albert, and he has looked at all the estimates of productivity of seaweeds around the world. So you can see the first two, I don't know if you can see my pointer actually, but the first two columns here are showing the brown algae. So kelps are in that second column of subtidal brown algae. And they have a pretty high average measures of net primary productivity. And on a per area scale, this productivity is equivalent in some places to productivity per area of forests on land, as well as to ocean phytoplankton. And what's interesting, if you look at how this productivity varies across latitude, as you move into the poles, so into the Arctic or more into the Antarctic zones, you actually have higher seaweed vegetation compared to the leveling off that you often get on land, suggesting that sort of in these high latitudes, per area productivity of seaweeds might be even more important. And if you study kelp blue carbon, or if you are at all looking in the literature on this, you might notice that there's a little bit of debate right now about whether or not kelp should be included, whether or not they're sequestering carbon at all, or if they are, whether or not that is significant enough to include in our global metrics. And just to succinctly summarize this is not taking in all the nuances, but there's general consensus that kelps are immensely productive and that their total extent is substantial. It's larger than most of the other blue carbon habitats. But most of the uncertainty here comes through major questions about what actually happens to kelp carbon. So questions about the fate of this carbon and how it's being cycled and stored in the coastal zone is really preventing its inclusion in these various frameworks. And this is largely because kelp are cycling carbon in a way that's almost entirely different from other blue carbon habitats. So here I put blue carbon habitats and terrestrial habitats in the same framework. So here I'm talking about mangroves and seagrass meadows and salt marshes. So these habitats have a standing stock of carbon that can be defined by their above ground or sometimes below ground root biomass. And then they're also, every year, they're actually accumulating carbon in the sediments or the soil, if they're on land, that like within the actual habitat. And this is stored in the long term and is what they would estimate as a carbon sequestration rate, this burial. So often if you wanted to study these habitats, you could take sediment cores and measure the amount of carbon being buried in them every year. This also, the fact that you have marine sediments, which kind of fall into a soil category, means that these habitats get included under the IPCC's land use, change, and forestry, which is why most of these habitats are included in blue carbon frameworks. It's because they are being stored in the same way as forests, so they can kind of slide into the frameworks designed for terrestrial forests. But seaweeds don't work this way at all. They're much more analogous to what happens with phytoplankton. So here you have a really large amount of productivity that occurs on the surface, either in the coastal zone for seaweed, or often a little more offshore for phytoplankton. And then a portion of this, or a large portion of this production, is remineralized and decomposed and consumed right in those in the photic zone. But a small amount actually sinks out of this layer and can enter the deep ocean. And it's that portion of either carbon from phytoplankton or carbon from seaweed that when it enters these deep ocean sinks, it can enter long cycling pools of carbon, and which can take hundreds to even thousands of years to re-enter the atmosphere. So in this way, seaweed is drawing down carbon from the coastal zone into the deep ocean. So if we want to understand how kelps are cycling carbon, we have to kind of follow the flow of this kelp detritus, or the flow of the kelp productivity. And so some work, actually this is work at Dalhousie by Bob Scheibling and his PhD student Kira Krumhansel, that estimated that most of the productivity of kelp forest is not grazed when it's live and attached to the reef, but is actually exported into the coastal environment. About 80% is exported as detritus. And there's also a lot of evidence that this detritus can end up in the deep ocean. So there's eDNA water samples that show seaweeds and kelps reach all the deep ocean basins of the world. There's DNA from sediment cores, from the deep sea and from deep fjords, showing that kelp is buried in these regions. And then there's also observations of seaweeds reaching the deep, and observations of the rocks that they actually can take with them when they're transported offshore, all of which suggests that at least some seaweed is reaching these areas. So the first postdoc that I did after my PhD at Dalhousie was in Norway, which Heike mentioned. This was part of the KelpX project, which was funded by the Norwegian Research Council. And the entire project was about understanding the fate of kelp detritus. And we did most of the work above the Arctic Circle in a place called Melangen Fjord. And this was a lot of diving work, but also a little bit of cruise work as well. And the system was really interesting. So we tagged a bunch of plants and measured all of the ways that these kelps were releasing detritus and releasing carbon into the coastal zone. And they were doing this by whole individuals dislodging, or by the ends of the blades eroding, or by this thing they called spring cast, where in the spring they would just shed all the old blade that they've been carrying around from the next year. And this spring cast is shown in orange, and it made up almost all of the detrital production. So it meant in this system, detritus was released as a big pulse right in the spring. So we surveyed our study sites where we were documenting this pulse. And we surveyed the seafloor into the deep subtidal zone to about 80 meters depth. And we found that the seafloor was covered in detritus. So this orange bar here is showing the percent of the seafloor that had some form of kelp detritus in it. So this is in March, but when we looked right after that pulse, we saw that actually the floor became quite covered with detritus. You could see this large amount of kelp detritus moving out of the shallow coastal zone next to the kelp forest and into these deeper habitats. And then in August, when we went back, it was gone, suggesting this is really quite a rapid flux. And at the same time, we were also taking trawl measures and various measures in the fjord right beside these sites, and found that our crews in May had substantially higher amounts of kelp detritus, and most of these fragments were actually full blades. So you could tell that they were the spring cast. So all of this suggests that in a few months, about half of the productivity in the coastal zone is released from the coastal zone, and a lot of that is actually making its way directly into this deep fjord area. And we know that this fjord in particular was actually bearing a lot of sediment, and so a lot of this carbon would have been buried as well. And more broadly, the project also looked more on the continental shelf and found evidence of kelp, both in the fjords, but also in trawl samples coming up in deep fjords, and then also in genetic signatures on the shelf about 15 kilometers offshore. So to fully understand this export, we took a bunch of measures of the different properties, material properties of the detritus, and ran particle tracking models out of this coastal fjord. And we found that about 10% of all the large fragments of kelp moved over 50 kilometers, and about 10% of all the small fragments moved over 200 kilometers. So there actually was quite a significant portion of this detritus moved quite far offshore. They were also clearly following the ocean currents in this model, and this is expected by other research in looking at movement of detritus. So this is still, this is quite convincing evidence that the productivity of a kelp forest can actually make it into deep areas where it could potentially move into those longer cycling carbon pools. But this is also only one small area of that global distribution. So to look at this at a larger distribution, we looked at, we basically ran a much coarser version of a particle tracking model, this time using a model of ocean currents that where we traced how long it took shelf water, water right beside the coast in the distribution of the kelp forest, how long it took that water to be transported across the continental shelf. So we call this the coastal residence time. So the time in days it would take for a material to actually cross the continental shelf and enter the deeper ocean. So here in Norway, the scale here is going from 0 to 300 days. So all the yellow areas are basically have very little chance that any detritus is going to make it into across that shelf break, because it'll be decomposed long before it could make it there. But in contrast, in Western Australia, they have quite a unique oceanographic feature here called dense shelf water cascades. And this means that you have really rapid offshore transport of water masses. And this can cause the coastal residence time to be about 15 to 20 days in some areas, which means that a lot of that seaweed could actually move with the water currents and cross that shelf break. So here we can estimate what this would look like globally. So this is still a little bit work in progress, but we use an average decomposition rate for kelp forest from a review that my colleague Morton is working up, and applied this to the global coastal residence time. I apologize for these colors. This was a graph I was sort of pulling out earlier today, and I didn't manage to get a color scheme that you could properly see. So sorry about that. But basically, the dark colors here are showing the areas within the distribution of brown seaweeds that have high proportion of export, and the really light gray colors almost have little to no proportion of export. And what this essentially shows is that depending on where you are and the ocean currents beside the kelp forest, makes a lot of sense, you're going to have wildly different chances of that seaweed detritus actually making it into deep ocean sinks. So this, of course, is a very coarse global model. So it's probably only getting a very small portion of the actual nuance and complexity. But to date, we're making most of the blue carbon estimates are using a very coarse estimate that was a sort of good first effort in 2016, but it only used 3 export studies, which I'm showing here, and only 2 of them were with seaweed. So I think we're at least improving our understanding. And what this really highlights is that some parts within the global distribution of seaweed could have exceptionally high levels of carbon sequestration potential, and some could have very low, depending on where they are. So if we wanted to sum up a little bit of what we know so far, we have a pretty good understanding of the per area rates of productivity for most of, or for many of the kelp forests in the world. And this is about 5 tons of carbon per hectare. And then if we use that estimate, which I think I forgot to say, but the estimate is actually 7% on average of that NPP is, I'll just go back. So the average potential export, if you sort of average across all these cells, is 7%. And if you crop it only to the areas that have fast enough bottom currents, where you might actually have movement of detritus's bed load, that becomes 5%. So if you apply that to the global area of kelp forest, given this known productivity, you're at about 50 million tons of carbon per year, which simply has the potential to be exported to the deep. Clearly, there's a lot more that needs to be done about nuancing that number, but still, it suggests that this is relatively high, about, well, just under 1% of the global fossil fuel emissions. What this also highlights is that the slower the decomposition of kelp detritus, the greater the chance that this carbon could be transferred to these deep sinks. Which leads the question, well, what controls the decomposition of kelp detritus? So we looked at this in the project in Norway. We ran various lab experiments where we looked at how kelp detritus decayed over time, how long it took the biomass to disappear. And for this species that we were working with in Norway, it took about 200 to 300 days. But in conditions without oxygen, hypoxic conditions, there was always sort of a refractory component where 20% of the biomass didn't decay and just stayed within our studies. So this is a pretty consistent pattern of what we see in lab studies. But we are interested in testing this in the field. So in 2018, I initiated the network, which is a network that ran a globally distributed litter bag experiment that measured the decomposition of 2 species of kelp across the Northern Hemisphere. So we conducted the same experiment in 12 regions. Each region had 3 sites, and we ran these litter bags, collected the kelps at various intervals, and measured how quickly they were decaying. And what was really interesting about this experiment is that the regions had this very large gradient in temperatures, from about 1 degree to just about 23 degrees Celsius, depending on where you were. So we found that decomposition rate was really fast at the low latitudes in Portugal and Rhode Island. And then in the Gulf of Alaska and in the Norwegian Sea, it was actually quite slow than at other higher latitudes. And this latitudinal gradient was explained by temperature, which out of all the environmental variables we measured was the best predictor of decomposition rates. And this temperature relationship is really interesting. So we looked at the export potential at every one of our sites, given the exact decomposition from these experiments. And we found that there is still a consistent relationship between the proportion that could be exported and temperature and latitude. So essentially, in warm, low latitude places, you have consistently lower chance of export compared to high latitude cold places. And we can use this temperature relationship to actually model this into the future based on various scenarios. So under a sort of short-term RCP 4.5 scenario, this relationship suggests there would be a 9% decrease in that potential export for this kelp species across the Northern Hemisphere. And for the longer-term 8.5 scenario, this could go all the way up to 43% decrease. So in summary, global warming could potentially speed up kelp detrital decomposition, which could reduce the potential sequestration. But our results also suggested that high latitude carbon sinks might become more important because these are actually places of very slow turnover of the carbon material, which leads to the question, well, what do we know about kelp forests in the Arctic? So when I first started studying kelp forests, which was at DAL in 2010, a lot of the work that I was reading and a lot of sort of the typical understanding of kelp forests tended to be from the temperate zone. But actually, if you look into the Arctic, this is showing all of the regions of the Arctic where there's been documented kelp in red. You actually see that kelp is pretty prevalent on a lot of Arctic coastlines. And it can be found in quite high Arctic areas where you have really cold temperatures, really long periods with sea ice where the kelp would be in complete darkness, and it's still managed to adapt and survive these quite extreme conditions. So these Arctic kelps seem to be there. They can get to quite high biomasses. But what's actually quite interesting about this is that if you look at the coastline of Canada, and look at the amount of coastline in the East Coast and the West Coast compared to the Arctic, potentially the kelp forest in Canada and the Arctic could be much larger than the kelp forest on sort of the East and West Coast, where we've been focusing a lot of our effort. So it's really exciting to understand a little bit about, or to understand more about these Arctic kelp forests. So after the work in Norway, I moved to Quebec City and started a great project with Philippe Archambault, who was doing such amazing benthic ecology work all across the Canadian Arctic. He was looped into these amazing networks. And together we wrote and funded the ArcticKelp project, which is an Arctic net project aimed at better understanding the kelp forests in the Canadian Arctic. And this project has sort of grown into this really exciting collaboration across a number of institutions with a bunch of great oceanographers and ecologists and great people to work with. And one of the key components of this project was a series of dive campaigns across the Eastern Canadian Arctic. So here, every site is showing a dive site. So we had 53 dive sites, all looking at between 5 and 15 meters depth. in various regions of the Arctic. And what was cool is that this not only did it cover sort of different interesting oceanographic features and in different areas, different substrates, but it also covered a very strong gradient in sea ice cover and also temperature. So we had areas in Labrador with very little sea ice, all the way up to Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic, where it was over 50% covered by sea ice. And just to give you a little idea about what this actually looked like. So these are the large Saccharina latissima forests. So this species is found off Nova Scotia as well, but it tends to not have this morphology, even though it's been reported here. So here this stipe is hollow, so it actually floats into the water column. It can be about 1 to 2 meters long, and sometimes up to 7 meters. And then the blade kind of just cascades down after it. And those were generally 3 to 5 meters, but sometimes about 1 meter across. Quite large, extensive forests. One thing that was really interesting about these forests is that because the continental shelf slopes so gradually, we could often drive the Zodiac with a drop camera, and we would see these forests for about 16 kilometers on the way to the dive site, and the depth would change like by 3 meters the entire way there. So these forests are very extensive, and the band that they're occupying is so much wider than many other areas I've explored in other coastlines, where normally sort of it just slopes down in the first 200 meters. So this is in the north around Ellesmere Island. This is Grise Fjord. So here you're seeing some kelp that's rafted up on the beach. So often we saw Agarum clathratum underwater at most of the dive sites, but on the beach you saw a mix of Agarum and also a lot of Alaria. And in Pond Inlet, again, we saw quite sparse cover of Agarum. You could see where it was scoured by icebergs in this area, and often became, this is sort of in shallow 10 meters where the ice scour would prevent a really high growth of the kelp. In the top left is Laminaria solidungula. So this is an Arctic endemic kelp. It's only found in the Arctic, the only species of kelp that's only found in the Arctic. And it was often associated with those large Saccharina latissima forests. And then also Hedophyllum nigripes is thought to be another Arctic endemic species, but it's depending on who you ask, it's quite similar to Laminaria digitata. And then also you get these Alaria and also these sea urchin barrens, which when we moved into Labrador, we actually lost a lot of the kelp forest and the system turned into an urchin barren. So overall, across all of these study sites, most of which, actually almost all of which were sampled without any prior knowledge of the region, so just went to the coastal zone at the right depth, we found a really high average biomass of kelp. So we found kelp in every location, and we actually had biomass of about 4 to 5 kilograms per meter squared, which is similar to the biomass that you might see in a pretty healthy kelp forest off maybe the eastern shore. So if you look at this biomass across the Arctic, you see that the places with the highest biomass were those yellow bars, and that's that really tall Saccharina latissima forests, which are driving those trends. And those are found in a lot of the region. And when we looked at how the kelp communities related to the various environmental drivers in the system, so here all of the pie charts that are big are showing areas with high biomass, and the very small pie charts are showing areas with very little biomass. So in places that were warm with not very much sea ice, we tended to have those tall canopy high kelp forests, whereas cooler places with high ice thickness tended to have just a little bit of Agarum and not very much biomass. And overall, we found there was no clear relationship between the type and the amount of rock and the type of rock. And actually, those two photos on the left here are almost exclusively growing on sand with tiny little pebbles. And the kelp is able to attach to the predominantly sandy substrate. We also found a really strong relationship between how low the kelp could extend. So this is the lower depth limit where the kelp stopped being at least 50% cover, and the open water period. So this is essentially the days where you don't have sea ice. So the less ice and less sea ice you have, the deeper the kelps extended. And finally, we use these data to make habitat or species distribution models to predict the total extent of these ecosystems. So these are very small maps, but they're showing the distribution of Agarum, Laminaria, solidungula, Alaria, and Saccharina, which were the 4 dominant species. They're in total covering about 300,000 kilometers squared. Again, because those coastal zones are so shallow, they actually extend quite far out away from the coast. And this is actually about 9% of the global extent of kelp forest. So this could be a significant ecosystem in terms of its total area globally, and it's just in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. We also found that when you projected it forward using predicted changes in sea ice and temperature, that all of the extent of Agarum, Saccharina, and Alaria all increased, whereas Laminaria solidungula, that Arctic endemic, was predicted to decrease in its aerial extent. But it's not only about seaweeds getting bigger and growing deeper in the Arctic. If you look at the associated seaweed species under and look at how their habitat distributions might change under different climate scenarios, all of the cryophilic species, so these are species that are in the high Arctic and are adapted to high Arctic conditions, they're all predicted to decline significantly in their total area. So this is the bar on the right showing those red declines. The bar on the left is showing more temperate species, which a number of them are projected to have small increases. So sort of the overall picture seems to be that we might be losing the high Arctic flora, which might be replaced by more temperate communities. So what could Arctic kelp forests look like in the future? First off, it appears that kelp forests are one of the dominant coastal ecosystems in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. And these are quite extensive habitats that are likely playing an important role in how the coastal ecosystem functions. And our estimates suggest that the total carbon stock and storage could increase under future climate conditions. But it also hinted that coastal turbidity and potentially the expansion of those sea urchin barrens in Labrador could limit this expansion. And then there's evidence that we could be squeezing out high Arctic flora and replacing them with more temperate seaweed communities. And this would be a type of borealization where Arctic coastlines start to look more similar to what we see in the subarctic and temperate zones. And this work would not have been possible without amazing community support from all of the dive sites and all the regions that we visited. This is a slew of budding marine scientists from Pond Inlet, and they are just wonderful to sort of show the seaweed, show all the fauna to, and we, it's a big thank you. It was a massive group effort to get all these samples. So segueing back to blue carbon, so I've sort of gone over estimates of total area of kelp forests, carbon standing stock, and even a little bit estimates of sequestration rate. So this is a critical step in understanding the potential of kelp forests to be included in blue carbon frameworks, but it's really only the first step in order for them to be actionable blue carbon habitats. For them to be actionable, there needs to be some sort of human impact on the ecosystem that's causing a decline. And then you have to, there has to be some management or intervention, some action that we can do that can actually maintain or enhance these carbon stocks. So an important first step here is, of course, to look at the area and the carbon cycling and all of this ecology, but understanding how these ecosystems are changing and also whether or not we can protect them in any way is sort of a very critical next step. And I'm not going to get into this very much at all, but I think it's important to highlight that even though the Arctic is expanding and on average, kelp forests are in decline globally. So this is showing an overview of all the regions of the world that have experienced a loss of kelp and a shift to turf algal dominated reefs. They tend to be occurring at sort of warm range margins, possibly where the waters are becoming too warm to support the cool adapted kelps, and instead you get different communities coming in. But overall, there's often either a direct or indirect effect of climate change behind a lot of the most recent declines in kelp forests. And if you look at the best estimate of the annual habitat loss, this was also done by Kira Krumhansel, actually, and she predicted that it was about a 2% instantaneous rate of loss per year. This is higher actually than coral reefs. There's a lot of error around this estimate, but it still just shows that a lot of the kelp forests over the last 20 years are have been in decline in many regions. And again, despite the fact that these habitats are covering a really large area and they are quite threatened and experiencing these pretty dramatic changes. If you just look at the amount of research effort going into kelp forests compared to coral reefs or tropical forests, so this is the number of publications on ecosystem services, on ecosystem decline, and on restoration. And so the kelp forest is in black, coral is in red, and forest is in green. So you can just see that kelps are sort of an order of magnitude understudied compared to these other habitats, despite the fact that they're also undergoing pretty serious decline. So it's a pretty big scale of this challenge. If you wanted to actually restore these kelp forests, you're decades behind in terms of the tools that you might be able to use, because people just haven't been researching them to the extent of these other habitats. And actually, if you look at existing coastal marine habitats in international frameworks, so this is the recent Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention on Climate Change, the World Heritage Convention, the SDGs, the Ramsar Convention, and the Paris Agreement. They are all but one of them is mentioning kelp forests less compared to all of the other coastal habitats. So your mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes, and coral reefs. And this, the lack of mention and the lack of inclusion and when we talk about ecosystems can translate to a lack of awareness, a lack of funding, and a lack of research effort. So that's also another challenge if we are to get to a stage where we have enough knowledge to actually manage these ecosystems to and prevent the large declines they're experiencing. So I've talked a lot about carbon, but for most people studying blue carbon ecosystems and a lot of people that are sort of talking these frameworks, there's definitely a push right now to move beyond carbon and to not just condense the value of an ecosystem or the importance of an ecosystem down to this one metric of carbon cycling, but to talk instead more broadly about all of the functions that this ecosystem can do and all of the possible services that that you could get from from seaweed forests, but also from other ecosystems. So this is often a sort of a typical diagram of what that might look like, where you talk about how the habitat can support biodiversity and sequester nutrients, make oxygen, increase the amount of fish. And all of this is like an overall function of the ecosystem well beyond carbon. So in 2019, as part of a research project between Norway and South Africa and Australia called Blue Connect, which I am leading along with a researcher in South Africa named AJ Smith, we sort of initiated this thing we call GEAK, which is a global ecosystem service assessment for kelp forests. And it includes 40 experts, biologists, ecologists, social scientists, and environmental economists from around the world. So I think there's 12 different countries that have regional leads right now, and 40 local experts included in this network. And overall, we're just looking for all of the evidence of these ecosystem services from kelp forests. And we're using the classification from IBIS, which is showing on the left, which just basically describes the different types of ecosystem services, or they call them nature contribution to people, that you might get from these ecosystems. So we're still in progress here, but to date, we have data collection from 49 ecoregions within the range of global kelp. And so these are all shown in blue. And what I can show you is one of the early steps in this data analysis, where we simply looked if there was evidence from each ecoregion that these different categories of ecosystem services existed. So if they existed and there was evidence for that, they're a dark blue present. If they're only present to a small extent, they're light blue. If there's evidence that they're not present or important at all here, then they're red. And if they're unknown, they are gray. So so here, these are the 4 different like broader categories: provisioning, regulating, biodiversity, and cultural services. And the x-axis is showing the proportion of ecoregions where there actually is these different categories for each service. So some highlights here is that there's pretty strong evidence that a number of ecoregions are directly harvesting kelp, even if some are just to a small extent. And the kelp is very important for commercial fisheries. There's also a lot of evidence that kelp is important supporting biodiversity, which is not surprising, but is coming through from a lot of different regions, and that it is in some way regulating carbon. But what was really interesting is that there's also evidence that kelp forests have these so-called cultural services, which can range from recreation and tourism to traditional knowledge, supporting identities, learning and inspiration, and a lot of other sort of important but less economically quantifiable services. So there's a lot of interesting work to be done in understanding the broader, I could say value, even though that's a very loaded term, but the broader functioning of these ecosystems. So thank you for keeping with me so far. It's tricky over Zoom sometimes, but I'm on the sum up slide. So overall, we have fairly good evidence that kelps are contributing in some way to carbon storage, and that this could be quite substantial, but they're also providing a slew of other benefits, including biodiversity, fisheries provision, and various cultural benefits that would be just as important to quantify and explore, especially exploring how they might be changing with climate. And there's suggestion that as our oceans warm, actually the potential of kelp forests to cycle carbon could decrease with warming, but that we might have changes in kelp stocks occurring at higher latitudes as our Arctic kelp forests increase, both in standing biomass, in aerial extent, and also in the depth extent. And there's an overall trend of global decline occurring for kelp forests around the world, and a really urgent need for scalable restoration solutions. And this can start by just increased awareness about the threats these ecosystems can face, but actually being able to manage and do something about declines in these habitats is a critical and often overlooked component of blue carbon research. So I'd like to thank you very much. I also thank the number of institutions that I have been traveling through for the last 6 years, and the amazing people that have helped along the way. And I'd be happy to take any questions.